But if you look at his career, mention one elite fighter.
So Poster wasn't elite?
If there's one boxer that's allowed to criticize anyone's resume, it's Canelo. The guy's literally fought everyone except for one person, but we'll put that to the side for now because this video is not about him. But is Canelo's criticism valid? My initial thoughts before doing my research for this video was that Bud has had a fantastic career with some great wins, but you might not think the same thing once you finish watching this video. I've gone through the entirety of Crawford's resume and picked out all of his wins that, in my opinion, have had an impact on his career in some way or another, whether that's for good or for bad. This happens to be the first 20 fights of his 41 fight career. In my opinion, if these first 21 fights never happened, it wouldn't change our opinion on Bud's career in the slightest, due to the opponents being of a lesser caliber and it also being so early in Bud's career that they don't have any impact on his career as a whole. So the fights that we'll be looking at are from his first fight with Andrei Klimov in October 2013 up until his most recent fight against Israel Madrimov in August of 2024. To decide how good of a win they are, there are 3 criteria that need to be taken into consideration, which will each be scored out of 10. Firstly, the level of opposition. This takes into consideration how good they were as a whole in their career. The better the opposition, the higher the score. Secondly, the timing of the fight. This looks at whether the opponent was in their prime when they fought or whether they were carrying any injuries. The closer to being at their best, the higher the score. And lastly, the performance. This looks at how good Crawford was in the ring, irrespective of the person in front of him. For example, if he puts on a masterclass against someone who isn't very good, he can still score a 10 for performance, as the ratings in the other categories will be lower to compensate for this. These 3 criteria will then produce an average on how good of a win it was out of 10. Using these averages, there will be 3 outcomes from this data. Longevity. Firstly, the average of all these wins will be added together to give one overall number. This can act as a benchmark for future resume videos as a comparator for other fighters' resumes. This leans heavily on longevity, as the more notable fights someone has, the higher this number is likely to be. Consistency. The second outcome will be the average score of all the wins, which leans more towards the consistency and standard of opposition, so padded records will suffer here. Overall. Thirdly, this will take into consideration both longevity and consistency by multiplying these 2 numbers together to give one big overall number. This will create a fair balance between fighters that have fought for a long time like George Foreman compared to someone that has chosen quality over quantity like Alexander Usyk. Without further ado, let's get started. I'll be starting with Bud's most recent fight and then working my way back. So the first fighter on the list is Israel Madrimov. I really rate Madrimov, I think he's exceptional. This would have been a 9 or 9.5, but since losing to Virgil Ortiz, I think Madrimov's stock has gone down slightly, so he gets an 8.5 for level of opposition. He was coming off a career best win against Kurbanov, and it was Bud's first fight at 154, so to choose Madrimov in your first fight in a new weight class is crazy, so he gets a 10 for timing. This is where it goes downhill slightly because the performance was very poor and could easily have been a draw, so the performance only gets a 4. This gives an average of 7.5. Next we have Errol Spence. Spence was considered without a doubt one of the top 10 pound for pounds in the build up to this fight. He was undefeated, 28-0, WBC and IBF champ at welterweight for 4 years, so level is without a doubt a 10. If you were to ask me before the fight, I would have said the timing was perfect for Spence and that he was at his peak. But because it appeared those car crashes and inactivity were very prominent, instead the timing can get a 9. This was a devastating career-defining performance for Crawford. This was supposed to be a 50-50 pick'em fight, and he made it look like Spence had never put on a pair of gloves in his life. This performance is undoubtedly a 10. This gives an average of 9.66 out of 10. David Avanesian was a solid European level fighter but has no wins on his record that made you think he was going to be a threat when this fight was made, so he gets a 6 for level. He was the younger man going into this fight and on a 6-win streak, including wins over Josh Kelly and Liam Taylor, so not in his prime but still a live opponent. He gets an 8 for timing. Crawford put on a fantastic performance in this fight and stopped Avanesian in the 6th. He gets a 9 for performance. This gives an average of 7.66 out of 10. Sean Porter was a great fighter and fought at world level for what seemed like forever. I can't remember the last time he fought someone that wasn't world level, and he beat almost all of them. So Porter gets a 9 for level. Porter definitely wasn't at his best when Crawford beat him, and it was the last fight of his career, but he was still only 33, 34 years old, so he wasn't finished by any stretch of the imagination, and he could maybe have won on that night if there was someone other than Crawford in front of him, so timing gets an 8.5. This was a very competitive fight throughout, and Crawford's own corner said at the end of the 9th round that Bud was down on the cards. Then you have the iconic moment of Crawford being annoyed that Porter might be ahead, so he decides to turn it up an extra level or two and put it on Porter and stops him. The way he decided to end the fight when he wanted to just bumps up this performance by 1 or 2. So I give him an 8 out of 10 even though it was competitive. This gives an average of 8.5 out of 10. Kell Brook was a great world level fighter. Obviously he beat Sean Porter and had many other great wins, so he can have a rating of 9 for level. Unfortunately, the Brook that Crawford fought was a shell of his former self, having already lost to Golovkin and Spence and literally breaking his face in both of those fights. He was never expected to have much of a chance, so he gets a 5.5 for timing. But Crawford can only beat what's in front of him, and he did so in quick fashion, stopping Brook in the 3rd round. Brook did win the first 2 rounds in my book, so it stops Crawford's performance from being a 10 and drops it down to a 9 instead. This gives an average of 7.83 out of 10. Mean Machine Kavaliauskas was a good fighter. He wasn't world level. He beat David Avanesian, who is probably his best win, but never won a world title, so he can get a 6.5 for level. He was undefeated at the time he fought Crawford, but was coming off the back of a draw against Ray Robinson, who is a European level fighter, so Bud would have seen some chinks in his armour from this fight, so the timing can get an 8. For the most part, Bud was very comfortable. He got caught quite a bit though, so was not great defensively, and he did get knocked down, which was never called, but he got the stoppage in round 9, so he can have an 8 for performance. This gives an average of 7.5 out of 10. I'm a huge Amir Khan fan, and he was a fantastic world level fighter in his prime, so he gets a 9 for level. Unfortunately, this fight came well out of his prime, and from the Canelo fight onwards, he was just trying to make the most money possible and showed very little intent on trying to win this fight. So timing gets a 4. Crawford looked great. The way the fight ended was a shame and controversial, which tainted the performance overall for me, so the performance can get an 8. This gives an average of 7 out of 10. Jose Benavidez Jr. was a good fighter, but by no means world level, as every time he did fight at world level, he lost. So he can get a 6 for level. He was undefeated, 27-0 at the time, fighting for his first world title, so you would think he would be up for this fight more than any other in his career, so he can get 9 for timing. It was another solid performance for Bud, and he managed to secure a great stoppage in the 12th round. It was honestly a beautiful stoppage. So he can get a 9 for performance. This gives an average of 8 out of 10. Jeff Horn was never really that good, and he is only really known for getting that dodgy decision against an old Pacquiao, so he can have a 5 for level. But to give some praise to Crawford, he did fight Horn when he was at his best. His confidence would have been through the roof after that Pacquiao win, so Bud fought Horn at his best, and he was moving up from 140, so there's an even added risk there, so this timing can have a 10. Jeff Horn became public enemy number 1 for this fight after the Pacquiao robbery, and everyone wanted Bud to beat him so bad, and that's exactly what he did. It really was just a one-sided beating from start to finish until Bud stopped him in the 9th. It wasn't quite as bad of a beating as the Spence fight, so it can get a 9.5 out of 10. This gives an average of 8.16 out of 10. I watched Julius Ndongo ice Troinovsky in the first round and then put on a boxing clinic against Ricky Burns, and I thought, wow, this guy looks incredible. But since then, his career has been nothing short of a disaster, so he gets a 5 for level. This fight was for undisputed 140 pounds. Ndongo is undefeated, and he held 3 of those 4 belts. Bud definitely fought Ndongo in his prime, and people were only happy to fight Ndongo after Bud had already humiliated him, so he can get a 10 for timing. This was a one-sided, quick beating, and Bud showed how much better he was than everyone else at 140 by beating the brakes off the other main guy in the division in just 3 rounds. So performance can get a 10. This gives an average of 8.33 out of 10. Felix Diaz is not a great opponent, and he has no notable names on his record. He can get a 3 for level. He had a loss to Lamont Peterson a few fights prior, and this fight with Bud was in 2017. Crawford was already an elite level fighter at this point, so to fight someone like Felix Diaz was a very questionable choice of opposition, so timing can get a 7. This was a superb performance throughout, and topping it off with a stoppage in the 10th is the icing on the cake, so the performance can get a 9.5. This gives an average of 6.5 out of 10. John Molina Jr. isn't great, but he has a few notable wins against Mickey Bay, Ivan Redkach and Ruslan Provodnikov, so he can get a 4.5 for level. Molina had already been beaten by 6 people at this point in his career, so timing gets a 3.5. But Bud did what Bud does and showed him that he's levels above and beat him up before stopping him in the 8th, so performance can get an 8.5. This gives an average of 5.5 out of 10. Victor Postel was a good fighter. You would say he was just about world level, but when he stepped up to world level against people like Josh Taylor, he just couldn't quite hang with them, so he gets an 8 for level. He was unbeaten at the time. Him and Crawford were both 28-0. He was the current WBC champ and was fighting off the back of a stoppage win against Lucas Matisse, so timing can get a 10. This was a solid performance from Bud. He knocked him down twice and won a fairly comfortable decision. I think he really wanted to get the stoppage and couldn't quite manage it, so for that reason the performance gets a 9 instead of a 10. This gives an average of 9 out of 10. Hank Lundy is an average fighter. He's very unorthodox. He's got no great wins, so he gets a 4 for level. He had already been beat 6 times and stopped by John Molina as well. This was very much a keep busy fight for Bud, so timing gets a 4. Despite getting the stoppage in round 6, Bud was getting hit a lot compared to usual due to Lundy being so awkward and throwing big looping punches, so performance can get a 7.5. This gives an average of 5.16 out of 10. Similar to Felix Diaz, Derry Jean had no notable names on his record. It was really hard to gauge what sort of level he's at, so I'm going to give him a 3. He had already lost to Lamont Peterson earlier in his career, and there is no real reason why Derry Jean got a title shot looking at the people he'd beat, but that's not really Bud's fault, so I'm going to give him an 8 for timing. And again, Crawford in this time was spectacular. He was levels above the people he was fighting back in 2015-2016. He scored 3 knockdowns against John and stopped him in the 10th. He can get a 9.5 for performance. This gives an average of 6.83 out of 10. Thomas Delorme was a decent fighter. Again, not world level by any means, but he's got some attributes that would cause anyone trouble. Fast, athletic, explosive, so he gets a 6 for level. He only had 1 loss at this point in his career, and he was on a decent win streak at the time, so the timing of this fight gets an 8.5. This fight was actually fairly competitive until the stoppage, and Bud was getting hit more than usual because of the speed of Delorme, so the performance can get a 7.5. This gives an average of 7.33 out of 10. Ray Beltran was a good fighter. He drew against Ricky Burns, but every other time he went up to world level, he lost, so he can get a 6 for level. He was on a good run before fighting Bud, and he went on a good run after fighting Bud, so it's fair to say that he was in a decent point in his career, so the timing of this fight can get an 8. This fight was a complete one-sided dominant performance, so it gets a 9. The only thing that stops it from getting a 10 is that he couldn't get the stoppage. This gives an average of 7.66 out of 10. Yuriorkis Gamboa was a fantastic boxer at 127 pounds, so I've put him at 7.5 for level. He was undefeated at the time, but he was definitely too small to be competitive at 135, so this was nowhere near Gamboa at his best, so I'll give timing a 6. Crawford boxed well. He dropped him 4 times, but I've taken off a couple of points due to Bud being the most hurt in this fight more than he's ever been in the rest of his career. So performance gets an 8. This gives an average of 7.16 out of 10. Ricky Burns was a solid world level fighter and 3-weight world champion, so he can get a 9 for level. He was still very much in his prime, holding the WBO title at 140. The only thing stopping the timing of this fight being a 10 is that Burns had just come off a competitive draw against Ray Beltran the fight before, in which he suffered a broken jaw. This was also Bud's first fight for a world title, so timing can get a 9. This fight was competitive in parts. It wasn't a wholly comfortable night's work for Bud, and by Crawford telling Canelo that Ricky Burns was elite just tells you that he rates him very highly. So he gets a 7.5 for performance. This gives an average of 8.5 out of 10. Andrei Klimov was fairly average. His only real notable win was a majority decision win against John Molina Jr., so level he can get a 4.5. Bear in mind this was back in 2013, he was 16-0, and this was really Bud's first kind of acid test to decipher how good he might be, so timing, I'll give a 9. Bud's jab was on point in this fight, but for the most part it was a pretty dull fight and went the distance. Bud winning 100-90 on all 3 judges' scorecards, so performance I've given a 7.5. This gives an average of 7 out of 10. Now that we've got the ratings of each of Crawford's wins, it's time to look at what this actually means. Because Crawford is the first fighter I've done this resume deep dive with, there is no one to compare him to, so these numbers won't mean too much until future videos, so make sure you subscribe to stay updated for future videos. Crawford has achieved a longevity score of 150.78, a consistency score of 7.54, and an overall score of 1,136.88. For the time being, Crawford is at the top of the leaderboard, and it seems like he's got a pretty good score all around. It's definitely going to take a very good resume to beat him off the top spot. In my next resume deep dive video, I will be going through Canelo's resume to see if he can beat Crawford's. My initial thought is, yeah, he probably will. I want to make sure that these graphs that I've made get absolutely full to the brim. I want to do resume deep dives on current fighters, past fighters, fighters from the early 20th century. Let me know who you want to see, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe, stay tuned for more.